On the night of my daughter's wedding, she looked me in the eyes and whispered, "Don't embarrass us. Just remember you're only a metalworker." The words burned hotter than the forge I had lived my life inside. My hands, scarred and blackened from years of fire and steel, had built roofs, gates, bridges that stood longer than their promises of love. Yet to my own blood, I was nothing more than a laborer, a reminder of a past they wanted to bury beneath their polished suits and borrowed prestige. I carried that sentence home with me like rust that clings and never lets go. In their eyes, I was not a father, not a man who sacrificed sleep and comfort, but a tool, useful only when the hinges squeaked or the pipes broke. I remembered how they laughed when I came to family gatherings with the smell of iron still clinging to my coat. They lifted glasses of wine and lowered their voices when I entered the room. My silence became their favorite stage, a place to showcase how much further they had climbed than the man with soiled hands. Yet my hands had carried the weight of their future. Every coin for their education, every brick in the house they now lived in, had been paid for by the strength of palms that blistered, cracked, and healed only to crack again. They did not see that. They did not care. To them, I was a man at a station, hammering away at lifeless ore. To me, I was shaping breath into cold stone, giving form to the invisible. The furnace taught me patience, taught me silence, taught me how beauty is born through pain. But family, my own flesh and blood, taught me humiliation. They looked at me as if I belonged to the earth beneath their shoes, not at the table beside them. I was not invited to speak of dreams or ideas. When I dared to talk about art, about what lived inside the iron I bent, they smirked. "Leave sculpture to real artists," they said. "You fix things. You don't create them." That night, I sat alone in the workshop. The fire was dim, the air thick with the scent of coal and sweat. I stretched my hands out under the glow, watching how light caught every scar, every burn. These were not the hands of a failure. These were maps, roads paved with sacrifice, veins etched with silence, bridges built without applause. And though my family could not see it, though they called me less than what I was, I felt something rising in me, as if the metal itself was whispering, "You are more than their words. One day, they will see." Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever lived through something similar in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, we continue. At the table, I was never a father, never the man who built the very home they gathered inside. I was only the metalworker. They used the word not with pride, not with respect, but with a smirk that carried the sting of dismissal. Between the polished silverware and glasses filled with wine too expensive for me to pronounce, I sat in silence while they recited their successes. They spoke of banks, of mergers, of degrees earned abroad, their voices swelling with the pride of those who believe they belong to a higher world. I was a shadow at their feast, a man whose seat was granted out of obligation rather than belonging. Every time my fork scraped against the plate, it felt louder than their conversations, as though I were disturbing a ceremony I had no right to attend. They exchanged glances over my head, sometimes even chuckles muffled behind napkins, as if the smell of iron still clung to me despite the soap and water I had used to scrub myself raw before arriving. My daughter's husband spoke once of investments, profits rolling in, and though his eyes never met mine, I knew the comparison lingered in the room, that his numbers and contracts were superior to my fire and hammers. I learned to lower my gaze, to fold my words back into my chest before they could escape. For what use were my stories of the workshop, the way a stubborn piece of iron, after hours of heat and patience, suddenly gave way to beauty, when to them it was only dirt, sweat, and noise? My silence gave them permission to believe they were greater, and their laughter carved deeper wounds than the sparks that once burned holes in my skin. But in that silence I felt something grow, like embers hidden beneath ash. Still, I endured their mockery. I smiled faintly when they used Metalworker like a curse, though inside I clenched my fists beneath the tablecloth. Their wine stained their lips red, their laughter filled the air, but I tasted only iron, bitter, sharp, unyielding. One day, I told myself, the weight of these hands would speak louder than their voices. One day, the fire they despised would burn a mark so bright it could not be ignored. When the house was asleep and their voices no longer pressed me down, I returned to the place where I still belonged, the workshop. The night was my companion, the fire my witness. Orders from customers lay stacked in the corner, but I did not reach for them. Those belonged to a world that paid for gates, railings, repairs. Tonight, I touched the metal not for money, not for survival, but for something deeper, for the soul that still throbbed beneath my scars. I gathered the forgotten pieces, scraps others would have thrown away, remnants too crooked, too stubborn, too flawed to serve any purpose. But I knew better. I saw in them shapes others could not see. Each fragment of iron carried memory, carried possibility. I struck the hammer not with the urgency of a worker, but with the devotion of a pilgrim. The sound echoed like prayer, each blow pulling something hidden out of the darkness. The sculpture did not come at once. It was not born from haste, but from years of silence. Years of words swallowed at family tables, years of laughter endured. My pain shaped the lines, my shame curved the edges, my faith in something unseen gave it balance. Sometimes I stopped just to look, to trace with my fingers the cold form that was slowly beginning to breathe. It felt alive, as though it had been trapped inside the metal all along, waiting only for me to listen closely enough to set it free. There were nights when exhaustion bent my back, when my hands trembled, when burns blistered again across skin that never had time to fully heal. But still I stayed, still I hammered, filed, polished. It was not a task anymore, it was confession. Every strike carried a word I never said to them, every spark lit the silence I had endured. Every contour spoke for me in a voice stronger than my own. I gave no one knowledge of it. To the family, I was asleep in my bed or mending some order they had no interest in. To the world, I was invisible. But in those hidden hours, behind walls blackened by smoke and lit by flickering flame, something was rising that would one day tear through the chains of their dismissal. In that silence, a secret was taking form, a truth forged in fire, sharpened by humiliation, polished by dignity. And though no one yet knew it, the day would come when that truth would step out from the shadows and stand taller than every insult ever thrown at me. I tried, once, to let them glimpse the fire that lived within me. At a family gathering, as they passed plates and praised themselves for promotions in business ventures, I opened my mouth to speak, not of wages or orders, but of the work that consumed my nights. I spoke of how metal bends like memory, how in the heart of fire something broken can be reborn into beauty. My words barely reached the air before they were sliced apart by laughter. "Who would want your pile of iron?" someone said, not even looking at me as they lifted another glass of wine. Their amusement drowned out the trembling in my voice, but it could not silence the wound tearing inside. My son turned his face away, as though ashamed that I had even spoken. His friends were there, polished young men in fine shirts, and he did not want them to hear his father speak of furnaces and scars. To him I was an embarrassment, a reminder that his life of clean hands and soft chairs had been built on the back of a man he now disowned in silence. When his eyes avoided mine, I felt the truth settle heavy in my chest. The blood I had fed, clothed, and raised would rather erase me than acknowledge the hands that carried him this far. The others quickly changed the subject. pushing me aside as one pushes a stray crumb from a tablecloth. My words disappeared beneath their laughter, their numbers, their pride in a world that had no place for a man who smelled of iron. I sat there, still, my fork untouched, my chest burning with a fire no one wanted to see. It was not rage, but something heavier, an ache born from years of giving without thanks, years of swallowing humiliation with every bite. That night I returned to the workshop, but the hammer trembled in my grasp, not from weakness, but from grief too heavy to contain. I wanted them to see, not my scars, not my soot-stained coat, but the truth that lived inside the steel I shaped. I wanted them to understand that art can be born from fire just as surely as from ink and canvas, but they would not listen. They had dismissed me long before I spoke, reducing my entire existence to a label they could sneer at. Yet in their dismissal, they gave me something greater than their approval. They gave me silence, and in that silence I forged my resolve. If my voice could not reach them, then the work itself would speak. If my son could not raise his eyes to see me, then one day he would be forced to lift his head before the world to face what I had created. Their mockery was the spark, their shame was the fuel, and in the shadows of my workshop, I began to believe that the very thing they despised would one day become the weight of truth they could never escape. The letter came folded in an envelope heavier than anything I had ever held. The paper bore the seal of the Royal Gallery, embossed with gold, stamped with weight and dignity. My name stood there, written carefully, not as worker or laborer, but as an artist. They invited me, not for repairs, not for utility, but for creation, for something I had made in the silence of nights when no one believed in me. My hands trembled as I read it again and again, the words burning brighter than any fire in the forge. I carried it home, hoping for once that they might see what I carried inside, that perhaps pride would soften their hardened glances. At the table I laid it before them, careful, almost reverent, as though placing down a fragile truth. For a moment they leaned in, eyes catching the royal crest, lips parting in surprise. But then the laughter began, sharp, merciless, echoing louder than hammers against steel. They called it a mistake, a clerical error, a joke played by someone who confused me with a true artist. They joked that perhaps the gallery needed a repairman for their doors, not a sculptor for their walls. Even my son, whose voice I once longed to hear in pride, smirked as if the very idea of me belonging in such halls was absurd. He waved the letter away, telling me not to get carried with dreams that did not belong to my kind, and in that instant I felt the gap between us widen into a chasm no bridge could close. I said nothing. Words had lost their weight long ago in this house. I folded the letter carefully, as though their laughter had not soiled it, and slipped it into my pocket where their hands could not reach. Their ridicule still clung to the air, but within my chest a different sound echoed, the beating of something that refused to die. For once, I did not need their recognition. The gallery had already given me more than they ever had. They had seen me. They had called me by a name my family never would. That night, alone again in the workshop, I touched the letter with soot-stained fingers, leaving marks on the clean paper, as though to seal it with the truth of who I was. They could dismiss me, they could laugh, they could pretend it was all a mistake, but I knew. I knew that the same hands they mocked had forged something that would step into light, and when that day came, no laughter would be strong enough to bury the sound of silence breaking. The nights stretched endlessly, longer than the days that preceded them, and in their silence I poured out everything that had been denied me. The world above slept, the laughter of my family already faded into memory, but in the solitude of the workshop I found a voice stronger than theirs. Each strike of the hammer echoed not as noise, but as prayer, an offering of my humiliation, my patience, my unspoken grief. The rhythm became a heartbeat, a pulse in iron and fire that told me I was not alone, even if no one else would stand beside me. The sculpture grew slowly, not in sudden leaps but in layers of persistence. I bent steel with my anger, polished curves with my regrets, and welded pieces together with the fragile hope that somewhere in the world, someone would understand what I had carried all these years. The furnace glowed with an almost holy light, casting long shadows that seemed to bow before the figure emerging from the fragments. It was not just metal. It was my silence given form, my pain lifted into shape, my dignity pulled out of the ashes where they had tried to bury it. There were nights when exhaustion pinned me to the stool, when my chest felt heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. I remembered their dismissals, the way their eyes passed through me as though I were furniture, a thing rather than a man. I remembered the smirk of my son, the cruel jokes of relatives who could not imagine beauty rising from hands stained black. And in those moments of weakness, I lifted the hammer again, letting their voices fuel the fire, letting every insult become another spark that drove me to strike. No one came to see me. No one asked where I disappeared to. No one cared why the mornings found me with soot still clinging to my skin. They did not notice the burns, the deep grooves of exhaustion, the silence that carried weight. But I no longer needed their notice. What I was building would outlast their blindness, would speak in a language they could not laugh away. And so the nights passed, each one carving another truth into the steel. The loneliness was sharp, yes, but it was also pure. In that emptiness, I could hear the whisper of the metal, the voice of the fire, and perhaps the whisper of God himself, reminding me that creation is not meant to be easy, that it demands suffering, demands sacrifice, demands that you give it the very marrow of your being. And I gave it all, night after night, until I no longer knew where my hands ended and the work began. The world did not know yet. My family refused to see. But within the walls of that workshop, under the watch of fire and silence, a masterpiece was being born. A secret stronger than their dismissal, a monument to every wound I had carried without complaint, something that would one day force the world to listen. The morning of the unveiling arrived with a weight heavier than any iron I had ever lifted. The letter from the Royal Gallery lay folded in my pocket, worn soft from the times I had touched it in secret, as if to reassure myself it was real. I told them, the family whose blood carried my name, that the invitation had come true, that the gallery was ready to reveal my work to the world. They did not even pretend to be proud. "Are we supposed to humiliate ourselves in front of real artists?" they said, the words slicing me as cleanly as a blade. They laughed, shaking their heads as if the very idea of my presence in such a place was comedy. Not one of them rose to dress, not one made a step to join me. I left the house alone, the echo of their dismissal following me into the cold air. I wore my oldest coat, the same one I used to shield myself from sparks at the forge. It smelled faintly of smoke and iron, no matter how many times I washed it, and I could still feel the roughness of soot trapped in its fibers. My hands, no matter how I scrubbed, carried the scent of metal that clung like a second skin. I walked through the streets as strangers hurried past me in fine clothes, women with jewels, men with polished shoes, all heading to the same place I was bound for. I felt their eyes slide over me as though I was a worker sent to repair something broken, not a guest, not an artist. The Royal Gallery stood before me, its doors tall and gleaming, marble columns rising like a judgment I was about to face. For a moment I hesitated. My reflection stared back from the glass, lined face, scarred hands, coat too old to belong in such halls. I almost turned away, almost convinced myself they were right, that I had no place here. But then I remembered the nights alone, the sparks, the hammer's rhythm like a heartbeat in the silence. I remembered the figure that had risen from scraps, the sculpture that had carried my voice when I had none. And so I stepped inside. The air was heavy with perfume, polished wood, and whispers. People gathered in clusters, their voices low, their eyes bright. Canvases hung in gilded frames, Marble busts stood on pedestals, light fell gently on paintings worth more than I would earn in a lifetime. I stood among them as an intruder, clutching the folded letter in my pocket, as if it could prove I belonged. No one spoke to me, no one looked twice. I might as well have been the doorman, or a cleaner waiting for instructions. But I knew. Behind the heavy curtain at the far end of the hall, hidden from sight, stood the truth of my life. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of years that had led me to this moment. They had called me nothing. They had called me only a worker, a man who fixed hinges and hammered iron into cages. But soon, when the cloth dropped and light touched the steel, the world would see what they had refused to see all my life. And whether my family came or not, whether they mocked or stayed blind, the sculpture would speak louder than any of their voices ever could. The gallery was filled with the low hum of voices, a sound like restless bees circling blossoms too delicate to touch. Men in tailored suits leaned toward one another, their words sharp and deliberate, while women in gowns whispered behind painted fans, eyes darting with curiosity. I stood at the edge of the hall, close to the shadowed wall, my back pressed against cold marble as if to disappear. No one knew me. No one approached. To them I was just another worker who had somehow slipped in unnoticed, someone who did not belong among polished shoes and silk gloves. The walls around me gleamed with the treasures of others, paintings drenched in color, sculptures carved from pristine marble, gilded frames holding the weight of centuries. The crowd moved from piece to piece, murmuring admiration in carefully chosen phrases, each word a performance meant to display knowledge, wealth, belonging. Their voices rose and fell, but none reached me. I was not part of their world, though it was my work that soon would command their gaze. At the far end of the gallery, rising taller than the others, hung the heavy curtain. It was draped across the space like a shroud, concealing what I had forged in the silence of countless nights. The fabric stirred slightly with the movement of air, as though restless, as though straining to reveal what it protected. People whispered more urgently when they glanced at it. Their curiosity sharpened. The new piece, they said, the mystery. Yet no one guessed who had shaped it. No one even glanced at the scarred man in the corner whose heart pounded with every breath. I felt the weight of years pressing into me as I stood there, unnoticed. Every burn, every humiliation, every meal eaten in silence at the family table, they all converged in this moment. I thought of the nights I bent iron with trembling hands, of the sparks that burned my arms, of the exhaustion that nearly broke me. I thought of the laughter in my son's eyes when he dismissed me as nothing more than a laborer. And now, here I was, watching strangers gather before a curtain that hid the very truth they all had denied. No one called my name. No one cared that I stood so close I could almost feel the thread of the drapery between my fingers. But my heart knew what was coming. Behind that cloth lived the voice I never spoke aloud, the dignity I had been forced to swallow, the life's worth they had all tried to erase. Soon the curtain would fall, soon the silence would break, and then the whispers would no longer belong to them, they would belong to me. The moment came without fanfare, only the quiet shifting of the crowd as the curator stepped forward. A hand tugged at the rope, and the curtain that had guarded my secret trembled before it gave way. In an instant, the heavy fabric collapsed to the floor, and the hall fell into silence so complete it seemed the walls themselves held their breath. All eyes locked on the figure revealed, and I felt my own chest tighten as though seeing it for the first time. There it stood, metal shaped into grace, iron bent into something that looked alive, as if breath moved quietly through its veins. Light from the gallery's lamps fell across the surface, gliding over curves and shadows, catching edges that shimmered like stars. What had been scraps discarded and forgotten, now rose together in harmony. Each scar of welding, each mark of fire transformed into strength. It was not just a sculpture. It was my confession. My years of silence given a body. My grief and my prayers captured forever in steel. The crowd did not move at first. They stared, their whispers dead on their lips. Then, slowly, something stirred in the room. I saw a woman's hand rise to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. A man in a fine coat blinked rapidly, trying to compose himself as if overwhelmed by something he could not explain. And then it spread, an invisible wave of realization, as if every soul there felt the same truth at once. Hands came together in applause, soft at first, then swelling, echoing against the high ceilings until it was thunder. Some wept openly, others whispered prayers they did not know they remembered. I stood apart, still in the corner, my old coat hanging loosely from my shoulders, the scent of smoke clinging to me. No one knew it was me. No one saw the scars on my hands that had shaped what they now revered. I could have stepped forward, announced myself, claimed the recognition. But I didn't. Instead, I watched as strangers bowed their hearts before the work I had given everything to. They were not applauding a man. They were applauding the truth that metal could hold dignity, that suffering could birth beauty, that silence could roar louder than laughter. In that moment, I felt years of humiliation lift from my chest. Not erased, they would always remain etched into me, but transformed, just as the iron had been. Every insult, every dismissal, every time my voice was cut short at the table, they had all poured into this creation, and now they stood powerless before it. The sculpture breathed light into the hall, and through it, I too finally breathed. The applause did not end quickly. It grew, layer upon layer, until it seemed the very air shook with it. People who had moments ago carried themselves with the cold confidence of the wealthy now leaned forward, desperate to see every angle, every hidden line of the sculpture that had silenced their vanity. Critics, whose pens were known for carving reputations apart with a few strokes of ink, rose to their feet, unable to contain themselves. Their faces, usually stone, were softened by awe. Words spilled from their lips, phrases like a voice of the forgotten, the song of iron, a prayer captured in steel. And the gallery itself, in a voice loud and proud, declared it the people's masterpiece, a work that speaks for those who have been unheard. I remained in the shadows, and still, no one knew the man who had created it was there among them. Strangers, not bound by blood, not tied by family, looked upon the work with reverence. Artists, whose names adorned books and catalogs, approached with humility, whispering to one another that this was not the labor of a worker, but the vision of a master. They studied the welding scars as if they were brushstrokes, the bends of the metal as if they were poetry. Some reached out, not to touch, but to hold their hands in the air close to the figure, as though its warmth could pass into their palms. I saw in their eyes something I had never seen in my own home: respect. It was not pity, not condescension, not tolerance. It was the acknowledgement that my soul had spoken through the fire and lived now in this creation. For years I had been invisible. For years my voice had been buried beneath their laughter. Yet here I was, without uttering a single word, finally heard by strangers who had no reason to love me, yet could not deny what they saw. In that moment, I understood something cruel and liberating all at once. Sometimes the ones closest to you are the most blind, their eyes too clouded by pride to see what stands before them. And sometimes it takes the gaze of strangers, pure and unburdened, to reveal the truth of who you are. They did not know my name. They did not know my face. But they knew me through the work. And through it, they gave me a place among those who create, not those who are dismissed. The gallery filled with praise, the sound of pens scratching, cameras flashing, voices rising in wonder. And though I stood apart, with smoke still clinging to my coat and roughness still in my hands, I felt taller than I had ever stood before. My silence had spoken at last, and strangers were the ones to listen. The next day, the gallery opened its doors once more, and the sculpture stood beneath the high light of morning as though it had always belonged there, as though the building itself had been waiting for it all these years. The crowd had changed from the night before. Fewer gowns and suits, more ordinary faces, people who had read the papers, who had heard the whispers in cafes, who had seen the headlines that called the piece a revelation. They came with curiosity, some with reverence, some simply to be near what the world was suddenly calling a miracle wrought from steel. Among them, moving awkwardly through the crowd like intruders who did not belong, was my family. They had not come out of love, nor out of pride. They came because the world had spoken a truth they had long refused to admit, and they could no longer hide from it. Their faces were pale, drained of the arrogance they once wore like armor. Their voices, usually sharp with judgment and laughter, trembled as they whispered among themselves. They did not laugh now. They did not dare. I watched them from a distance, hidden as I had always been in their presence. They walked slowly toward the sculpture, their steps hesitant, as though each pace forward revealed another wound, another memory of words they had once thrown at me. I could see the shift in their eyes when the sculpture came into view. At first there was disbelief. They stared, waiting to find the flaw, something to diminish, some excuse to dismiss what stood before them. But there was nothing for them to tear down. The figure shone in silence, breathing with a dignity that denied every insult they had ever spoken. They circled it like guilty children, searching for cracks, searching for an explanation. My son's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He closed his mouth again, pressing his hand against his chin as though the gesture alone could hide his shame. My daughter's eyes darted nervously to the plaque at the base, where my name was engraved for all to see, etched into permanence by the gallery itself. She blinked again and again, as if her eyes refused to believe what they read. The son-in-law, who once smirked at me with the easy arrogance of youth, now stood stiff, his shoulders shrinking with every second he faced the truth that loomed above him. They sought excuses. I could see it, the desperate flickers of thought racing behind their eyes. Perhaps the gallery had made an error. Perhaps someone else had done the work and put my name upon it. Perhaps it was all some strange accident, but the excuses died in their throats. The welds, the lines, the shape bore too much of me, too much of the man they had refused to see, for them to deny. The silence between them grew heavier than their words had ever been, pressing down until their shoulders bowed under it, and I stood in the shadow, watching as their arrogance crumbled in front of the very thing they had once ridiculed. It was not vengeance I felt, not even satisfaction. It was something colder, quieter, the knowledge that truth had at last risen above their scorn. They had spent years making me invisible. Now they stood in a room where my name could never again be erased, carved not into their memory, but into history. Their pale faces lingered before the sculpture long after others had moved on, unable to walk away, unable to admit what they saw, unable to reconcile the man they had mocked with the master whose work silenced the world. And I knew then that they would carry this shame like a shadow for the rest of their days. They stood there, rooted to the polished marble floor, as if the plaque itself had shackled their ankles. My name, plain, ordinary, the same one they had spoken for years with contempt, now glowed under the light, as if the letters themselves were reborn. They stared at it too long, each of them trying to pretend that this recognition was natural, that they had always believed such a thing possible. But their bodies betrayed them. Their hands fidgeted, their shoulders sagged under invisible weight. Their eyes darted nervously when strangers passed by, whispering my name with admiration, repeating it as if it carried power. I watched from my quiet place in the gallery, and I could see the truth unraveling on their faces. Shame had carved itself into them, the way the fire had carved itself into my hands. My son's jaw twitched, his lips parting slightly, as if he wanted to speak, perhaps to claim some piece of this, to tether himself to the glory of a father he had dismissed. But no sound came. He pressed his mouth closed again, and his throat tightened with the effort of swallowing words that would no longer serve him. His pride, once sharp and easy, faltered under the weight of a silence he could not escape. My daughter tried harder to maintain the mask. She lifted her chin whenever others glanced her way, forced a smile, nodded in feigned pride. To the casual observer, she must have looked like a woman pleased, honored even, to stand near the creation of her own blood. But her eyes betrayed her. They trembled, never resting for long, flickering toward the plaque and away again, like a moth afraid of the flame. I saw her swallow hard when an elderly woman pressed a hand to her chest and whispered, "What genius! What vision!" as though she could not believe iron could hold such tenderness. My daughter's pride cracked in that instant, for she had never once spoken such words to me. Not in all the years I had bent metal for her comfort. The son-in-law stood stiff and rigid, adjusting his tie again and again, as if the straightness of fabric could grant him composure. He spread his stance wide, nodded solemnly at the sculpture as though he were part of the story, but his eyes were wet, his skin pale. He was the one who had once laughed the loudest, mocking me openly, dismissing the workshop as a place fit only for tired hands and men who failed at ambition. Now he tried to stand as if the light of the sculpture also belonged to him, but guilt clung to him like a shadow, revealing what no polished gesture could hide. They were surrounded by strangers who did not know the history, who looked at them and believed they were the family of a great artist. And in that moment, it must have burned them more than any flame from my forge ever could. Because they knew. They knew what those strangers did not, that they had never believed, never supported, never even paused to consider me more than a laborer. And now they were trapped in their own performance, clapping lightly with forced hands, nodding with false pride, as the world praised the man they had silenced. I remembered the tables where they laughed at me, where every story I tried to share was cut short. I remembered their words. Who would ever want your pile of iron? The cruel smirks, the way my son once turned away from me, ashamed to call me his father. And now here they were, their mouths sealed shut by the very iron they mocked. They could not erase the plaque, could not tear down the sculpture, could not undo what the gallery and the world now saw as truth. Their laughter had no place here. Their arrogance had dissolved into silence. I almost pitied them, standing there exposed, masks crumbling, guilt rising like heat around them. Almost, but not quite. For pity was something I had given them too freely in the past, when I forgave their sharp words, when I accepted their dismissal as if it were natural. This was not pity. This was the quiet justice of time, the return of every humiliation, not through vengeance, but through undeniable truth. Their shame was etched in their eyes, heavy and raw, a weight that bent their posture lower than mine had ever been. Yesterday they laughed. Today they tried to appear proud. Tomorrow they would live with the memory of how the world celebrated the man they had tried to erase, while they themselves stood like impostors beside a name they could never claim as theirs. The sculpture had spoken, the plaque had judged, and their guilt would follow them long after the gallery lights dimmed. I did not step forward to expose them, did not raise my voice to remind them of their cruelty, did not demand apologies that would have meant nothing. I had no need. My presence was enough. I stood near the sculpture, my coat hanging loose from tired shoulders, the smell of iron still clinging to my skin, the scars of a lifetime etched deep into my hands, and yet in that moment, I was taller than the marble columns, taller than the gilded frames on the walls, taller even than their pride. My silence carried more weight than their years of laughter ever had. They avoided my eyes when at last they noticed me, standing just a few steps away. My son, whose back had so often turned against me, lowered his gaze to the floor, as though suddenly discovering the polished marble beneath his shoes was more fascinating than the man he once called just a metalworker. My daughter's forced smile faltered, her lips trembling with the effort of pretending pride, while her face betrayed shame. The son-in-law shifted uneasily, the arrogance drained from his posture, leaving only a hollow shell of the man who once sneered at me across the dinner table. They stood there, cornered not by my anger, but by the truth they could not escape. I said nothing. For what use were words now? Words had been wasted on them long ago, tossed aside as easily as coal dust shaken from a sleeve. Anger would have been too small for the moment. Fury would have diminished what the sculpture already declared without my voice. Dignity. That was the only companion I needed now. I let my silence stand as the verdict, as the witness, as the final act of a man who no longer needed to prove himself. The applause of strangers rose again in the gallery, not for me, but for the work itself, for the steel that carried my spirit within it. Every clap was a sound my family could not silence, every admiring glance a mirror reflecting their own blindness. I stood still, my face calm, my heart steady, letting the light from the sculpture fall across me like a crown I had not asked for, but had earned all the same. They wanted me to falter, to shrink, to remain in the role they had written for me. But I did not. I stood without gloating, without triumph painted across my face, without even a smile. I did not bow to them, nor did I turn away. I simply remained, unmoved, unshaken, unashamed. The very stillness of my body, the quiet steadiness of my gaze, became louder than any accusation I could have spoken. And in that silence, I felt something greater than victory. It was freedom. I was no longer bound by their dismissal, no longer chained to the need for their recognition. I had surpassed the reach of their words, risen beyond the sting of their ridicule. For the first time, I did not stand beneath their judgment. I stood above it. They were the ones held captive now, their pride broken by the dignity of a man they had tried to erase. I remained there, beside the sculpture, as if guarding it, though in truth, it guarded me. It was my voice, my truth, my shield. I did not need to fight. The battle was already over, and without a single word, they understood it too. The days that followed stretched into something I could never have imagined, a season of revelation that felt almost unreal. The sculpture no longer belonged to me, nor to the dim hours of my workshop, nor even to the gallery where it was unveiled. It became part of the world itself, a living thing carried from mouth to mouth, from page to page, from soul to soul. Newspapers ran stories on their front pages, photographs catching the way the light clung to the steel, as though the material itself breathed. Headlines declared me not merely a craftsman, not even an artist, but a man who had wrestled beauty from the bones of metal, who had forged the silent dignity of suffering into something immortal. My name, once an object of laughter within my own home, was now a word strangers spoke with awe. Critics who had built reputations by dissecting and dismantling the work of others stood silent before the sculpture, their pens trembling as they searched for words strong enough to match what they saw. They wrote that it was not just art, it was testimony, a declaration that pain and humiliation could be transfigured into something luminous, untouchable. They compared it to works enshrined in cathedrals, to statues that had endured centuries, to pieces that had outlived their makers and spoken across generations. My name was now placed beside those of the masters whose works I once studied in quiet awe, names I never dreamed would share a page with mine. And the people, ordinary men and women, those with no claim to knowledge of art, came in waves. They stood before the sculpture not as critics or scholars, but as human beings. I saw students sketching its curves as if each line carried a lesson. I saw mothers tracing its outline with their eyes, whispering to children that strength could be born of struggle. I saw old men and women who lingered longer than others, their eyes glistening, as if the steel itself mirrored their own hardships back to them with dignity instead of shame. Some wept openly, others prayed. Couples clasped hands in silence, their breath slowing as if the sculpture had calmed something restless in them. It spread beyond the gallery. Newspapers became magazines, magazines became broadcasts, and soon my work was shown in places I had never stepped foot in. Universities wrote letters declaring their wish to preserve my methods, to teach my name. Cultural institutions invited me to speak, though I declined more than I accepted. The truth was, I had no hunger for stages or microphones. My words had never mattered to those closest to me. It was the iron that had spoken for me, and it was enough that the world finally listened. Then came the officials. City leaders, government representatives, men and women with polished shoes and heavy medals arrived, and they placed honors into my hands. I stood as they spoke to me of service to culture, of a voice for the people, of a legacy that would endure. And when they clasped my calloused hands in theirs, I saw how carefully they held them, as though the burns and scars were treasures instead of stains. For years those same hands had been hidden under work gloves, dismissed as dirty, fit only for labor. Now they were lifted into the air, applauded, celebrated, treated as proof of sacrifice and devotion. The same marks they once mocked became the very reason strangers bowed their heads with respect. And yet through it all, I did not allow pride to consume me. I accepted each recognition quietly, my heart steady, my voice calm, for I remembered what had birthed this work. Every curve, every weld, every gleaming surface bore the imprint of humiliation endured, of silence swallowed, of nights spent alone with only the fire to hear me. The world saw beauty, I remembered pain. The world heard triumph, I remembered dismissal. Applause filled the air around me, yet in the depths of my memory, I could still hear their laughter at the family table, the cruel way my son turned his face away when friends asked about me. Those echoes would never fully fade, but they no longer bound me. They had been transformed, melted down, and reforged into something no ridicule could destroy. And perhaps that was the greatest justice of all. Not the medals, not the newspaper praise, not even the reverence of strangers. The true justice was that I no longer needed their validation. The very people who tried to erase me were now powerless to silence the truth of what I had built. Their scorn had been buried beneath the roar of a world that finally recognized me. They were left standing in the shadows of a legacy they could neither claim nor undo. For me, the sculpture was never about vengeance. It was never about rising above them in fury. It was about endurance, about dignity, about taking all that had been broken in me and giving it form so that others could see that suffering does not end in ashes. It can be remade into something eternal. And so I stood in those days, not as a man who had won, but as a man who had endured, who had held on to truth long enough for the world to find it. Justice had come, not through anger, but through bronze and steel. When I finally returned home, I carried nothing in my arms. The medals they had pressed into my hands, the certificates written in flowing ink, the honors that glittered in the light of official halls, I left them behind. They were tokens, yes, but they were not the weight of what I had built. What I brought back with me was heavier, deeper, quieter. It was the certainty that truth always finds its shape, that no matter how long it lies buried under scorn, it rises like fire through iron, demanding to be seen. I crossed the threshold of the same house where for years I had been dismissed, and though the walls had not changed, the air inside no longer pressed down upon me. My family sat there, waiting. No one dared to laugh anymore. No one raised their voice to fill the silence with dismissive chatter. Their eyes searched me as though seeing a figure they had never truly known, a man they had only half believed existed. My son, who who once turned from me in shame, lifted his gaze and struggled to hold it steady, as though facing a truth he wished he could undo. My daughter twisted her hands together. Her voice caught somewhere between apology and fear, though no words escaped her lips. The son-in-law kept his posture straight, but his face betrayed him, every line etched with discomfort, every breath heavy with regret. I said nothing. Words were no longer needed. They had spoken enough for all the years behind us, and their voices had withered into dust against the steel of what I had created. I placed my coat on its hook, the same soot-stained garment they had mocked 100 times before. Yet now, in their eyes, it was no longer a symbol of dirt and shame. It was a relic, a witness, the cloak of a man who had carried fire in his chest and turned it into something immortal. Their silence told me everything. They would never again dare to call me just a worker. That insult had died the moment the curtain fell in the gallery, and it would never again rise from their lips. I walked through the rooms in my home as though seeing them anew. The table where my words had once been cut short now seemed smaller, unable to contain the weight of what had happened. The walls that had heard my quiet humiliation now stood like silent witnesses, bearing scars of memory they could never erase. And though my family shifted uneasily in their seats, unable to look at me for long, I felt no desire to wound them with reminders. Justice had already been done, and not by my hand. It had been carried out in bronze and steel, in lines and curves that spoke louder than I ever could. In the days that followed, I did not boast of what had happened. I did not parade the honors through the streets or retell the story at every chance. I returned to the forge, to the rhythm of hammer and flame, to the solitude where I had always belonged. But something had changed. The air itself seemed lighter, the silence no longer cruel but peaceful. Where once I worked to prove myself, now I worked only to breathe, to continue the conversation I had begun with iron. My hands were the same, scarred and burned, but when I looked at them I no longer saw shame. I saw legacy, carved deep into my skin, carried forward in every scar. And beyond my walls, the sculpture lived on. People continued to gather before it, strangers I would never meet, whispering my name with reverence. Children pointed at it with wide eyes. Artists studied its form. The weary found comfort in its strength. My name had become more than letters on a plaque. It was etched into memory, into history, into the very spirit of a country that claimed me now not as a worker, not as a shadow, but as a master who had given shape to truth. That was the gift I carried home. Not medals, not applause, not even recognition from those who had once dismissed me. What I carried was the unshakable knowledge that dignity, though delayed, cannot be denied forever. They had called me nothing, and I had answered with steel. They had tried to silence me, and I had spoken in a language they could never unhear. And so my name remained, not only in the bronze and steel of the sculpture, but in the hearts of those who had seen it, in the eyes of those who would remember, in the whispers of generations yet to come. My family would never again dare to strip me of worth. The world itself had written my truth, undeniable, unerasable, in lines that would outlast them all, and that, I knew, was the legacy of my hands.